What's up? My name is Lamb. This is Lamb Nation back at it again. As promised, I'll be reading chapter 1 of Candace Owens' Blackout. How Black America can make its second escape from the Democrat plantation. I did go live earlier and I read the introduction, but I did not realize that was not the first paragraph. So I'm going to read the first paragraph on conservatism. There has been a lot of conjecture about how I became the person I am today, why I believe what I believe, what drives the energy that so deeply commits me to the truth. The answer is and will forever be my grandparents. I was 9 years old when my parental grandfather showed up at my childhood home and upended my life as I knew it. Up to that point, it was the custom for my three siblings and me to visit my grandparents' home on the weekends. They lived in a middle class neighborhood in Stamford, Connecticut, and a home that was well kept and comfortable. We loved our weekend visits because they had a yard we could run around and play in, and where my grandfather could teach us to ride bikes down their long driveway. It was nothing like our home. As a family of six, we lived across town in a small three-bedroom apartment within a rundown, roach-infested building. Living among a cluster of impoverished residents meant that fistfights, police visits, and drama were commonplace. I am told that this is what inspired my grandparents to insist that our entire family move in with them, a fear that their offspring might become that of their surroundings. And so, in short order, we were whisked away from the instability of our neighborhood into an environment that would more properly fertilize our futures. In retrospect, this move across town was one of the greatest blessings of my life. It gave me my first real chance to choose something different. I didn't know it at the time, but it would come to represent my earliest introduction to conservatism. Planting the seeds of conservatism. My grandfather was born in 1941 on a sharecropping farm in Fayetteville, North Carolina. Born into the segregated life of the Jim Crow South, his childhood was shaped by work and routine. He took on his first responsibilities when he was just 5 years old. It was his task to lay the farmer it was his task to lay the farm's tobacco out to dry in an attic. He tells me today that he would complete this task at the crack of dawn before the blistering Carolina sun could make the prospect unbearable. He was one of 12 children and everyone had a job to do. His father, my great grandfather, was a notorious philanderer who would leave his wife and children intermittently to live with his mistresses. His actions placed a further strain on his family financially and pressured on his many sons to step up and take responsibility. The burden forced my grandfather to become a man at a young age. In one instance, still just a young teenager himself, my grandfather decided to show up at the home of his father's mistress. He there confronted his father, telling him that he needed to return home to his family and take care of his responsibility. Watching his mother and siblings suffer from the dishonorable behavior of a man formed immutably elements of my grandfather's character. He made the decision then that when the time came, he would become the man his father never was. One day he would prioritize his family above all else, and indeed he would. It is necessary to know who my grandfather was in his day to understand who I am in mine. In the prism of our genetics, I am the light refraction of my grandfather's spirit. My character, my work ethic, even my stubborn nature are so closely embedded in him. There is no doubt that my grandfather experienced real racism in his childhood. In the 1940s, segregated South, the domestic terrorism of Democrat Ku Klux Klansmen was part of a parcel of the Black American life. I should pause here to explain why I refer to them as the Democrats Klansmen, since in the elaborate rewriting of their own history, their party has attempted to disassociate themselves from the Ku Klux Klan. In the spring of 1866, just 1 year after the Civil War, a group of six Confederate war veterans met in the law office of Judge M. Thomas Jones and began the Ku Klux Klan. The group was dedicated to what would be defined as the lost cause, a post-war belief that the Confederacy pro- proposed was heroic and just. They began menacing black Americans and their Republican allies locally in an effort to retain white supremacy. Later that same year, looking to raise the stakes of the Klan from a local club membership to a nationally recognized organization of influence, they elected their friend Nathan Bedford Forrest, a Democrat national delegate, to the senior position of KKK Grand Wizard. Author Jack Hurst said of Forrest, as the Klan's first national leader, he became the lost cause avenging angel, galvanizing a loose collection of boyish, secret social clubs into a reactionary instrument of terror still feared today. Under Forrest's leadership, the Klan began a proper reign of terror that consisted of midnight parades, whippings, and murders. By 1868, less than 2 years after their inauguration, the Ku Klux Klan had infiltrated the Democrat Party's campaign for the presidential re-election. Their efforts began in the spring, with Forrest taking meetings with racist whites throughout Atlanta to organize statewide Klan membership in Georgia. Shortly thereafter, Klansmen strategically murdered George Ashburn, a white man and Republican organizer. Forrest's friend Frank Blair Jr. was nominated as the Democrat vice president candidate to support New York Governor Horatio Seymour, whom they selected to be their presidential hopeful. Their campaign slogan was "Our ticket, our motto. This is a white man's country. Let white men rule." But despite their best efforts, Republican presidential nominee Ulysses S. Grant defeated Seymour and won the national election. That is not to say the Klan's efforts were not somewhat successful. In fact, in the states where they murdered the most blacks, Georgia and Louisiana, Grant lost. Today, Democrats will make the claim that the Klan, although led by a Democrat delegate, with the express purpose of winning them the upcoming election, was not technically established by their party. This is utter nonsense, born of nuance and doublespeak. The Klan was created to do their bidding and led by their party leaders and their effort to do so. Fortunately, throughout rigorous policy and reforms, President Grant fundamentally annihilated the Klan, but some 40 years later, they would experience what came to be known as their rebirth. In 1915, white men draped in bed sheets walked down Peachtree Street in Atlanta, firing their rifles in the air to celebrate the release of the silent film Birth of a Nation. The feature-length production told the story of brave sacrifices that the Confederate Klansmen had made to protect the South. The film was an adaptation of a book, The Klansman, which romanticized and glorified the days of the Ku Klux Klan. The book was written by a man named Thomas Dixon Jr., a dear friend and classmate of incumbent Democrat President Woodrow Wilson. Wilson himself was a racist who began resegregating the federal workforce while in office, made the extraordinary decision to screen the film in the White House. With his patronage, the film became a blockbuster success. It made no difference that the film distorted blacks as rapists, villains, and whites as their oppressed victims. Merchandisers began selling Klan hats and robes. The Klansmen had made a comeback, and it would take many decades before they would lose power again. It was this rebirth clan that was it was this rebirth clan that my grandfather was made to contend with in his youth. What is remarkable, though, is the manner in which my grandfather recounts his dealings with them. My grandfather tells me that Klansmen did not like my great grandfather. At night, the riders would visit their home and spray bullets through the window. My grandfather says the children would run to the back of the home and hide under the bed, and my daddy would grab the shotgun and shoot back at them boys, he recalls. Though it would be wrong to state that he looks back upon these moments fondly, it is correct to say that he reflects upon them with pride. Not with bitterness or anger, but pride. I regard his referring to the Klansmen as boys as a Freudian slip and a powerful degradation of their desired legacy. My grandfather's memory renders them powerless against his father's fearlessness. Is it not peculiar that those who live through such evil can speak of those times from a position of such strength, while those who live not a day of it choose to bemoan it with such cowardice. I often make the statement that liberalism is a symptom of remarkable privilege. In times of true injustice, no one debates gender pronouns and microaggressions. In times of real conflict, no one demands the government come take their guns. This was especially true for black Americans in the segregated South during a time when engaging in any inappropriate behavior, hanging out in the streets past dark, public intoxication, using a facility not designated for your skin could amount to more than just embarrassment. It could amount to death. Conservatism then is about sense and survival. Leftism is the plaything of a society with too much time on its hands. My great grandfather was 16 years old when he took a trip up north to Connecticut. He met my grandfather, he met my grandmother, then phoned his father to say that he wouldn't be coming back home. They married at 17 years of age. Then almost 4 decades later, and after raising 3 children of their own, my 3 siblings and I moved into their home. Living with my grandparents was a bit of a culture shock. There were Bible studies every week, prayers before every meal, and more rules than I felt were necessary. Everything centered on the concept of respect and how even our smallest action were manifestation of character. My grandfather awoke every morning at 4 a.m. to fix us a massive southern breakfast ahead of school. We had grits, eggs, bacon, and biscuits, and on special mornings, pancakes too. Sometimes, in an early morning fall, I or one of my siblings would come down the stairs and silently sit at a dining table. Soon after, we discovered that our grandfather had prepared a plate for everyone but us. If we openly inquired as the slight, my grandfather would pretend he did not see or hear us. Only then would we remember our offense. We had not greeted him with good morning. As soon as we correct our mistake, my grandfather would look at us warmly as though we just arrived into his room. Well, hello, baby. How'd you sleep? He'd say. His point was clear. It was disrespectful not to greet one another, just one of his many rules. My grandfather expected my father and older brother to help with the yard work. My sister and I, however, were never required to do such a thing. Yard work was a man's job. It was that simple. Instead, my sisters and I, all but a year apart, needed to focus on behaving like respectable young girls. My grandfather would hold doors for us, pull out chairs for us, put our jackets on for us ahead of Sunday service. They say youth is wasted on the young. How I wish I could go back and relish in how positively spoiled I was by my grandparents. That is not to say that we weren't reprimanded. Our adult that's not the word. Our admonishments. Our admonishments came our admonitions just came in a different form, and in my young mind it was the worst form imaginable. There is one instance in particular that has stayed with me always, mainly because it's the only time my grandfather made me cry. One night I woke up a bit cold in a slumber. I walked to the thermostat and cranked the heat as far as it would go. When we woke, the house was boiling. At breakfast that morning, my grandfather blessed the food and made a particular departure from his usual words. Dear Heavenly Father, he began as he always did, thank you for this food in which we are about to receive. He then unexpectedly interjected, Lord, please help Candace to realize she should not be messing with the heat in the middle of the night. At 10 years old, I was positively convinced that my grandfather had a direct line with God Almighty Himself. I sprang up from my seat before he could finish, sprinted to my bedroom, and burst into tears. I was embarrassed that my grandfather had discovered my infraction and positively mortified that he had taken the very dramatic measure to report it to God. Could it not be resolved within the lower level court of family? Was it necessary for him to make an appeal to the Supreme Court of God? I was inconsolable. Later, my grandfather apologized for upsetting me. Still, his point was clear. There was a hierarchy of authority in the house. In the biblical scriptures of Genesis, what is done in the dark shall come to light had never run more clear. At around the time that I entered high school, my parents moved us to another side of town. I wish I could say that I remain on the early path that my grandfathers had laid before me, but like so many other young Americans, I was lured by more of a liberal life. I wanted to be cool and liked and normal, so I slipped into a more secular existence that, with time, corroded my values. With my grandparents' watchful gaze no longer a concern, I was free to live as I pleased. There were no more prayers, no more Bible verses, and just a little time I came to view my grandparents' teachings as illustrations of my prior bondage. A season of drought. Much has been whispered about the hate crime that I experienced in high school. Leftists use it as a gotcha. Their less than extraordinary claim is that I sued my school for racism, thereby proving that racism is real and I am only pretending that it isn't for profit. My favorite part of this narrative is that it's always presented as an expose. We discovered something that Candace Owens doesn't want you to know. I laugh at this assertions. Foremost, because even a most preliminary of online searches of me will reveal that long before I entered politics, I gave a TEDx talk titled The Truth About Our Activism, which was about the hate crime that I experienced. So much for trying to hide it. Ironically, it was exactly this experience from my childhood that sobered me into the reality of race politics and those who profited from the perpetuation of both. The story began one night in 2007 when I was curled up on a couch watching a film at my boyfriend's home. Throughout the film, my cell phone kept ringing. Since my service was spotty, I chose to ignore the calls and set my phone's ringer to silent. In retrospect, it's amazing to consider how that one innocuous decision would transform my life. Later, when I returned home and my reception was restored, I noticed that there were four voicemails to match the missed calls. I thought it was strange that the calls came through back to back and that the anonymous caller decided to leave a message each time. Suddenly worried that there might have been an emergency, I listened to the voicemails. Dirty N word. We're not gonna tar and feather your family. Dirty N word. We're gonna tar and feather your family. I'm gonna kill you, you know. Just because you're effing poor and you're black, okay? You better not effing you better not be effing there, 'cause you might get a bullet in the back on your head. You big whore, you effing whore. Martin Luther King had a dream. Look at that N word, he's dead. That N word is dead. Harriet Tubman, that N word, she's dead too. Rosa Parks, that effing N word, she's dead. They went on and on. It is difficult to land upon the correct adjective to convey exactly what I felt when the messages had concluded, except to say that my reaction was physical. It was like having the wind knocked out of my chest and unexpected force stealing my oxygen immediately. I was overwhelmed and suffocating all in one. The funny thing is that I can still feel it. When I think back to that moment in 2007, I recall every detail so vividly that it makes my heart ache. I ate for high school Candace alone and crying, unaware of what the next morning would bring. High school Candace couldn't possibly have known it, but the ugliness and hurt would be but a rough pathway to enlightenment. But there is no portal to our past, only our careful retrospective observations, and what will stun me about that night is in fact that I did nothing and told no one. I was immediately stunned into inaction. I felt fearful, shocked, embarrassed, and remarkably alone. Call it an opinion, but I believe high school must rank chiefs among the most traumatizing years of any person's life. It's an awful period of teenager angst and uncertainty, compounded within a threatening timeline of life decisions to be made. Most students are trying to figure out where to fit in socially, what clothes to wear, whose lunch table to sit at, whether or not he/she likes you back. If I had within possession a time machine that could bring me back to high school, I would set fire to the machine. Truly, the only thing that got me through those years was ego. I wore mine every day like an armor to mask every plausible point of vulnerability. The morning after I received the messages, I felt as though I was dying on the inside, but through the lens of teenage vanity, the inside isn't what counts. And on the outside, I was my usual full confident self. I exhibited no signs that I had cried through the night. My first period class was senior seminar. It was a philosophy course where my teacher encouraged open discussion and debate about politics, current events, and the fallacies that lay between. The style of the class was open forum. I think for many of us, the course became a form of necessary therapy, a rescue from the mounting external pressures that threatened to combust us all. I don't recall what the topic of the day was or what prompted me to raise my hand and volunteer a response to it, but volunteer I did. I can't tell you what response I was looking for in that moment and from that classroom filled with pupils, but I shared it all. Maybe I was just feeling bad for myself. Maybe I wanted to shock them in a way that I had been shocked. Maybe I was looking for sympathy or some general consensus that the world was irrevocably broken. But I made the decision to share it all. And the chain of events that it set off was something that I could have never predicted. In a responsive moment of absolute authority, my teacher commanded me to get up and follow him to the principal's office. Upon hearing the voicemail messages, she immediately phoned the police, and my entire life transformed thereafter. It would turn out that the perpetrators were a group of boys led by my former friend Zach. Zach was upset that I started a relationship with my boyfriend and had less time for him. So he and his three friends, whom I had never so much as met, found themselves bored and under the influence one night. Prank calling me seemed to be a perfectly reasonable way to pass the time. Incidentally, one of Zach's friends happened to be the 14-year-old son of our city's mayor and the future Democrat governor of Connecticut, Daniel Malo. For the media, the political connection proved irresistible. Within days, my face was splattered across the front page of every newspaper across the state, and I was a repeat story on the evening news. They played the voicemails ad nauseum. Since none of the boys would formally admit to their role, and because a politician's son was involved, the police brought in the FBI to analyze the voicemails. My time was divided by the sensationalism. It felt as though every single person, teacher, student, and parent alike had entered in a social verdict. There were some people who were convinced I was lying since that Zach admitted was admittedly and boldly declaring to our classmates that he took no part in it. Some began to invest in the Machiavellian narrative that I had phoned myself. More innocently, others believed that I was simply accusing the wrong guy. As the leading bastion of progressive, as the leading bastion of progressivism, a civil rights, the NAACP were more than happy to insert themselves into the narrative. They beeline to the front steps of my high school where they greeted news cameras, anxious to receive statements pertaining to the injustices of the investigation. To their credit, they rightfully called out the unusual delay of justice that was more than likely tied to the case's political angle. Administrators from my school were protecting the perpetrators because of the mayor's son, and the NAACP to took them to task. When the NAACP did not do, however, was ever actually speak to me. I never had an interview or a meeting with any of my so-called allies who were so eager to speak out about racism but not interested in me, the real person at the center of the story. It took 6 weeks before the FBI investigation concluded, before the article stopped being written, before the opinion letters to the editor stopped accompanying every newspaper, and before my name was officially cleared as a co-conspirator in my own case. As it turned out, I had not phoned myself. Subsequently, arrests were made and charges were brought. I was labeled officially as a victim, and then everybody disappeared. Everybody but me, of course. I was left to deal with the emotional roller coaster of sudden, unwanted infamy and controversy, followed by utter desertion. If this narrative sounds familiar to you, it may be because it has become part and parcel of our mainstream media agenda. A school shooting takes place only to have the survivors hijacked by gun control activists looking to jam through their policies in a time of high emotion. A black man is killed by a police officer, and his image is used to further the narrative that white cops are murdering black men for sport. Over and over again, somebody else's real pain and tragedy are reduced to media talking points to further a political agenda. Emotions are elicited and concern is feigned until a bigger story comes along. This soured my perspective on the world early in life. Fundamentally, I began to believe that the world was happening to me, that I was a tragic Shakespearean figure doomed to fail because of the unfortunate circumstances of my childhood. This quite naturally led me down a path of liberating myself from any concept of personal responsibility. I drank, I partied, I got into fights. Everywhere in life, I created chaos because chaos came to falsely represent a state of freedom. I felt free from rules, free from regulations, free from any accountability, and because I felt that my life's narratives had been decided for me, I turned to anorexia to reassert myself. For 4 years, I restricted how many calories I consumed. The lighter I felt I could make myself physically, the lighter I felt mentally. I felt free from the weight of my past. But with time, what was supposed to feel like freedom began to feel like bondage. I was pretending that a life with no rules made me feel freer, when in reality it made me feel insecure. I was losing more than pounds, I was losing myself. This was leftism unleashed. Harvesting conservative seeds. There is a Bible proverb that reads, "Train up a child in the way he should go, and when he is old, he will not depart from it." In early 2013, I got a call from my grandmother. I got a call my grandmother was sick. By the time my grandparents had moved back to Fayetteville, North Carolina, in their retirement, they purchased property and built their dream home upon a plot of land that my grandfather knew well. It was a sharecropping farm that he grew up on. We were told that my grandmother would be out of the hospital by the end of the week. I packed a bag and traveled from New York to Fayetteville to visit her anyway, and I wasn't the only one. As a symbol of her matriarchy, everyone got on a plane: cousins, brothers, sisters, and aunts. For the women, for the woman who had given us her all, we knew we needed to show up. The doctors insisted that she would be released in 2 days, and as it turned out, she would be dead in 2 weeks. Unaware that it was the last time I would see her, I spent most of my time bragging to her about my fancy new job in New York City. In retrospect, I think my grandmother knew somehow. She knew the doctors had missed something and that she would never return home. She took care to speak to each of us in such a way she hadn't before. When my grandmother turned her attention to me, I exuded my practice confidence. I showed her an expensive new designer bag I had just purchased, and I told her all about my new job in private equity. I thought she would be proud of me, proud of how successful I'd become, and I thought wrong. My grandmother, as she always did, saw right through the facade. "Candace," she began, "I worry about you in New York. I feel like you are losing yourself." I told her I was fine and not to worry. Believing that she would indeed be discharged in 48 hours, I bid her farewell and told her I would call her in a few days. That was the last conversation I ever had with her. She died 10 days later, a shock and blow to my family that is still felt today. Grief consumed me, guilt consumed me, and while the grief was foreign, I knew the guilt well, because there had been a quiet voice that had been with me since that high school hate crime, one that I chose to muffle over and over again from the back of my mind. That voice, that voice, gentle as it were, was unrelenting. It was patience, it was kind, but it was unrelenting, and the question was always the same. Are you ready to sit down the weight of victimhood? Are you ready to run this race of life truly free? And suddenly I was ready. I was ready to become how my grandparents had raised me. I replayed my grandmother's last words in my head. She was right. I was losing myself. I recognized that my current worldview was not serving me. I needed to change my perspective, and I started by asking myself a simple question. What if the world is not happening to Candace Owens? What if Candace Owens is happening to the world? It was a daunting question. It implied that nothing was owed to me, and that even those situations that were not necessarily my fault were, in the end, certainly going to be my problems to contend with. I embarked on a personal audit of my life that brought me to a deeper consideration of my grandparents' sacrifices. While my grandfather was growing up on a sharecropping farm drying tobacco, my grandmother was living in the Virgin Islands unwanted because she was considered crippled. At just 10 years old, she spent a full year of her life hospitalized after a surgery to correct her hips. I had never known my grandmother to walk without a limp. She lived in a constant state of physical pain, but never once had she or my grandfather ever complained. They did not complain as children, nor did they complain as adults, not even as they were forced to contend with the world's problems in addition to their own. Yet there I was with a full-fledged victim mentality, upset that life hadn't been fair to me. It was pathetic. I knew it was my time. It was time to return to the only values and principles that had ever made me feel truly content. The first principle was to refuse the victim narrative. If my grandfather could reduce the Klansmen to boys, surely I was capable to reassessing my own points of victimhood. And so I mentally revisited the high school hate crime. In retrospect, I found it interesting to consider that in today's society, we have developed something of an obsession with determining a victim and a villain and then closing the door on any further analysis. Maybe we ought to blame Disney movies. Our earliest point of indoctrination that there needs to be a hero and a bad guy in every storyline. The hero wins, the villain loses, and the credits roll. Off screen, journalists have taken on the responsibility of passing judgment within the confines of absolute goodness or badness. Such blanket assessments have proven to be a profitable model because sensationalism and hyperbole sell. Of course, humanity is such more complex than we like to believe. If the media had any nerve to dig beyond racist white boys, phone victim black girl, they may have accidentally landed upon a much more human narrative. As I mentioned earlier, Zach, who was dubbed by the media as the ringleader of the attack, was my former friend. The fact alone, under even amateur analysis, should have served as a clue that his actions were not inspired by deeply held racist views. Prior to the voicemail, Zach and I had spent nearly every day together over the course of a school year doing what high schoolers do, eating junk food, talking about our dreams, unloading our anxieties. Then rather abruptly I got a boyfriend and all of that ended. I became every bit of the stereotype of a young teenager in love. I stopped hanging out with my friends and my every second became about my new relationship. If all this sounds remarkably immature, it's because it was. It was textbook meaningless high school drama that led to a series of irreversible events. It is likely that after losing someone whom he trusted and confided in daily, Zach was hurt. It is likely that under the influence of alcohol, that hurt morphed into anger, and in a moment of childish impulse and stupidity, he thought, what can I say to make Candace hurt in the way that I am hurting? It is likely that in thinking of the most hurtful and hateful things he could possibly say to make me hurt, he chose racial slurs. People don't like to hear that assessment because it's too human. It doesn't feed the media beast. It doesn't quench our insatiable thirst to quickly identify evil, and socially conceal the evildoer. I sometimes wonder if we so often seek to point out ugliness as a cheap, form, formulaic way to convince ourselves that we are good. Look what that bad person did. I would never do that. Therefore, I am good. The resulting truth is that the media's surface analysis of that night destroyed 5 lives. the four young boys who were publicly stained as racist before they began their lives, and me, who was publicly labeled as a victim before I had began mine. I knew what Zach did that night was wrong, and I was under no illusion that it deserved consequence. But now in a return to my conservative principles, I was wondering whether there was any premise to his wrongful actions or to my victimhood. Could I evolve? Could he evolve? And who are those who insist that we ought not to? Returning to our conservative roots, the glorification of victimhood is exclusively promoted by the left. It becomes necessary that I first define exactly what I mean when I refer to the leftists and liberals throughout this book, and why I will at many times use the identities interchangeably. Liberalism is defined as a political philosophy based on liberty and equality before the law. It is the allegiance to a set of principles that guarantee those who follow them a society with more individual freedoms. True liberalism pursues principles like the right to life, right to vote, freedom of speech, etc. When our forefathers wrote right to life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, they meant a right to life literally. On behalf of Black America, I will make an argument that liberalism has only ever been practiced by conservatives in this country. Leftism is defined as any political philosophy that seeks to infringe upon individual liberties and its demand for a higher moral good. Leftists concern themselves not with principle, but with some greater morality that must be achieved. The issue with leftism is that moral goodness is, of course, subjective. Not so long ago, white supremacy was deemed the higher moral good, and in its pursuit, leftists infringed upon the rights of Black Americans. Today, economic equality is established higher moral good the left is after. And we will soon unpack just how many liberties have been arrested in its pursuit. So why are we seeing resurgent conservatism through our Western societies? Because self-described liberals, those who like to view themselves as centrists, are realizing that the hollowed middle ground of politics has been consumed by leftism. Leftism has been able to operate under the guise of liberalism by claiming to want a certain type of equality, but demanding economic equality can be accomplished only by infringing upon individual liberties. The nuance here is important. Both liberals and leftists find themselves allied by the concept of equality and an inability to recognize that their goals stand in radical opposition to one another. In essence, there is nothing more illiberal than leftism. And although many liberals have awoken themselves to this impossible partnership, others remain unable to achieve such clarity. Alas, what remains of the doomed union between liberals and leftists exists under the Democratic Party, a political group that champions leftist solutions to the perpetual detriment of Black America. The entire Democrat platform is built upon an everlasting string of victims versus oppressors. And Black America is their favorite horse to bet on when it comes to jamming through their policies. And the less oversimplified version of American history, blacks are a permanent underclass who must commit their votes to a Democrat politicians for rescuing. Democrats see inherent racism and struggle in nearly everything, thereby destroying nearly all racial progress that has been achieved thus far. The sad truth is that nearly every policy they promote invariably harms Black America. Indeed, there is something about progressive policies that always lead to regressive results for Black America. But what if Black America simply refused their offers? What if we formally rejected the victim narrative, thereby rejecting the slow poison of leftist policies? What might happen if Black America collectively called the left's bluff on racism, thereby reducing their claims of perpetual victimhood to the ill, effective emotional strategy that it is. Could we collectively make a return to our conservative roots? And that has been chapter 1. Next chapter is chapter 2 on family. If you would like me to do a reading on that, just comment below and let me know, and I'll do that sometime next week. Let me know what you think of the book so far. Go back to my first video where I did the live and listen to the introduction, listen to the chapter 1. Please like and subscribe. Let me know what you think about the book so far below, and what you think of Candace Owens in general, even though I think I know what a lot of people have to say about her. But this has been Candace Owens, Blackout. Peace.